Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, haunted bisexual gender fuckery in Japan. This is episode 481. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. Our author, A.N. Tate, was born in Tokyo and grew up with stories about kitsune and other Japanese spirits. They now live in Brooklyn, New York with their family. Our narrator is yours truly. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their adult creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. Here we go. One Summer Evening by A.N. Tate. Hitoshi stopped at the broken-down gateway to rest his hand on the crumbling wall that encircled the old estate. The last time he was here, the view had been magnificent. Now the stagnant pond with its splintered bridge had frozen over. Beyond it crouched the once grand mansion, oriented northeast toward the Demon Gate. The jagged cedar shingles of the main entrance hall stuck up like gapped saw teeth from the white crust of snow. The veranda sagged with rot. Bamboo blinds hung raggedly from the eaves. One of the roof beams had fallen. The maw of blackness within seemed to devour the wan winter morning light. "You're really going in there?" said the boy who'd accompanied him. "I really am." Hitoshi shook off his straw coat and put them in a neat pile at the threshold. Shivering in his traveler's robes, he tied a cloth around his eyes, slung his biwa lute strap across his chest, and took up his stick. "Have the sutra?" He heard the boy pat his chest, indicating that he'd slipped the rectangle of rice paper the monk had given him into his robe. "Then you'll be safe," Hitoshi said. "Take me in." The boy took his arm. "Why cover your eyes?" "You know better than to look directly at a fox spirit." More, he wanted to avoid recognition until the right moment. He hoped the blindfold and the beard would suffice. They crossed the bridge, then crunched across the courtyard. On the way, he paused to touch the arched cherry tree he knew was there. But instead of rough bark, his hands brushed the smooth mound of a buttock. "Hanoi," he whispered her name as if her ear were right by his lips. Her haunting had begun. His heart quickened. His hand sought the cold neck of the biwa and came away with something long and thin winding around his fingers. A hair. He shook it off. "Go home." With a scuffle of feet, the boy was gone. Hitoshi tapped with his stick to feel his way. The stream would be to the right, and here came a memory of an arched pink-soled foot dipped into the water, a white koi rising to nip it. When the vision cleared, he continued to the main hall. The scent of the abelias that used to line the path wafted to him. Laughter rang out, followed by the clink of a porcelain bottle returned to a lacquered serving tray. Summer heat flushed across his skin. Crickets chirped. The elegant fragrance of incense greeted him. His stick struck the edge of the veranda. "Ah, look who's here!" A man's voice greeted him. The monk had warned him not to engage, but to recite the Heart Sutra constantly. But then the monk didn't know the real reason he'd come. "Am I welcome?" Hitoshi said. "Of course!" A hand took his elbow. He'd been prepared for the fact that Hanoi would have drawn more lovers into her thrall. Still he bristled. "Is the lady of the house here?" "She'll join us when she's ready." The man's breath stank of sake. Hitoshi stepped out of his wooden sandals and placed a tentative foot on the first step. Sure, he'd sink through rotten wood, but the stairs held. His bare feet padded across the polished floor as the man escorted him to a cushion. He sat down and caught the man's hand. He had to know whom Hanoi had selected to replace him. Stout fingers, rough with calluses. The thickened skin of the palm where a hilt would rest. He imagined the body it was attached to, stocky, strong. Hitoshi released the hand. "How about some refreshment?" a woman said. A moment later, she wrapped his hand around a blood-warm cup. Sake, redolent with overripe melons, overlaid with citron. He sipped and listened to the conversation. There were 2 women, both entertainers, and 2 men, likely provincial warlords. Really, was that the best she could do? It was an insult. He strummed his biwa. "Perhaps a song about a great battle?" "That would be an honor," one of the warlords said. "No," cut in a third voice. "The moon is full and lush tonight. Sing about that." "How appropriate," Hitoshi said. The casual, almost bored authority of this new voice, so assured of obedience, gave him a bitter taste. This was a man of refinement, one who would know fine poetry and scholarly texts. Honoe would find such an intellect irresistible. Hitoshi arranged his robes and took up his pick. The room hushed at the first note. He smiled. He'd trained hard, but there was a bit more to his playing than skill. His biwa was enchanted and enabled him a little magic. He used it now to perceive the essence of those around him. With a chill he understood the 2 warlords were ghosts, the women human. The third man's essence emerged as a 7-tailed fox. Maybe Honoe had bored of humans. Worse, perhaps this kitsune had been her lover all along, and Hitoshi had only been a dalliance. He pictured the 2 foxes fornicating, and his fingers almost jangled the next chord. The warlords clapped when he finished. Next he played some popular folk tunes, while the women danced and sang. "Time for a rest," the lord said when he'd played a while. Hitoshi set his biwa aside and accepted another drink. "How is our fair hostess?" Something coiled under his tongue. A hair. He fished it out. "She sends her regrets and enjoins us to show you her hospitality in her stead." The 2 women rustled up to Hitoshi. "Fan him," said the lord. A breeze cooled Hitoshi's face. "It's quite hot, isn't it?" he said. Oh, this haughty lord, who presumed to speak for Honoe. "And you are quite overdressed for summer," the lord said. One woman pulled off his outer coat. The sleeve caught on the biwa strap he'd wound around his wrist. She let the garment fall, then undid his sash and opened up his neck. "His fingers must be sore," the lord said. "Soothe them." "Let me see," said the woman. Her breath brushed his hand as she slipped each finger in her mouth and drew them out. Hitoshi smiled. Kitsune or not, this lord would not get the better of him. Much better. She guided his hand down her neck to the hard ridges of her clavicles. He ran his finger to the hollow in between, then found his own path along the bony line of her sternum. Inside the sweat-dampened silk of her kimono, he found a breast, heavy and soft as pounded sweet rice. His fingers sought out her nipple. It was erect, eager for his touch. Its hardness would feel good in his mouth. "Such strong fingers," the woman breathed. "You must spend hours practicing." Hours, yes, for a whole year, to compose the perfect song for Honoe, the song that would ruin her. She withdrew his hand and guided it to the curved flesh of her thigh. A dewdrop of wetness dampened her skin. His lust fluttered as he traced the trail upward to its source, then slid his finger along her inner lips and rubbed her clitoris. So slick and hot. She sighed and tilted her hips. It was a valiant effort, but no human could compare to Honoe. He withdrew his hand. "My lady injures me with her absence." "She'll come when she wants." The lord's voice curved upward, as if he were smiling as he spoke. "But you ladies are giving the game away before the chase." Open his robe. So the Kitsune lord wanted to play, did he? Honoe could control her arousal like no one he'd ever met. She'd taught him a thing or two. "His muscles must be sore," the lord said. Hitoshi leaned back on his elbows as the women peeled back his robes. The Lord tossed out the occasional command until they had rubbed his bare chest and shoulders. It gave him a vague, pleasant tingle. It wasn't all just hospitality. Kitsune were wily, and he suspected this one was looking for a sutra painted on his body. That certainly would have banished the haunting, but lacked finesse. "Give his feet more intimate attention," the Lord said. A cloth draped over his lower leg, skin pressed against his foot. Then his toe was enveloped by soft, wet flesh. He sucked in a gasp. "He likes that," said the Lord softly. Oh yes, he did like it. It took him back to a sweltering afternoon when he and Hanoi had lounged on the veranda. She'd worn just her underkimono, and her dark nipples had poked up under the thin silk. Too hot to exert himself, he'd snaked a foot up between her thighs and teased her with his toe. "Oh, Hitoshi," she chided. "You're so lazy." How did this lord know? They must have shared a similar moment. Or perhaps she told him about it and they laughed at him. Hitoshi gritted his teeth, but his traitorous cock stirred. "Is the lady so indisposed she must impose upon you to entertain me?" Hitoshi said. "Take him in your mouth," was the only reply. Slick lips wrapped around him. "Slide up and tug on the head," the Lord began. In a soft, steady voice he gave the woman explicit directions. When to take the whole length into her throat, when to pull back to the foreskin, to rim the swollen head, when to linger. The heat of desire took root in his groin and began to spread. He struggled to quell it, but the Lord knew exactly how to arouse him. No, it was more than that. The sequence, the rhythm, was all Hanoi. There were, apparently, no secrets between the two foxes. Hitoshi raised his head, wishing he could meet the Lord's eye to show his defiance, at the same time grateful for the blindfold as the pressure in his groin sharpened. He gripped the woman's head as she swirled her tongue around his shaft. The heat had turned to a fire that threatened to overcome him. "Enough," the Lord said. The woman tore away. "But he's so close." Hitoshi lolled his head back, panting. His cock ached for friction as the saliva cooled on his skin. Its hardness ebbed, and his anger toward this haughty lord grew. He yanked his robe closed and sat up. "I have a special song," he said, "but it's only for the lady of the house." There was a pause, then, "Leave us." Giggling trailed by him as the two couples exited. He took note of the direction of their footfalls, so he'd know where to find the two women. "Haven't we played enough games?" Hitoshi said. The silence yawned on. Then a rustle of cloth. The Lord stood right above him. Hitoshi tensed, ready to defend himself. Cool silk brushed his cheek. He drew back, startled. Then he breathed in the scent. Aloe wood, muscular and leathery with a twinge of bitterness, rounded out with meadow flowers. Then that more ethereal quality, of shafts of light in the forest, of cold rock on a mountain, and mist off a waterfall, threaded through with a wild musk that raced through his veins and thickened his pulse. Suddenly he understood. The Lord was not Honoe's lover. He was Hanoi. Hitoshi clutched the long sleeve and pressed it against his cheek. "Play it for me," Hanoi murmured. Had she guessed who he was? Or perhaps she thought she could ensnare a new lover. Hitoshi reached for his instrument. The coldness of it against his skin brought him back to himself. The notes came out pure and true. When he sang, the music flowed through him of its own accord. He could sense the kitsune swaying to his will. Good. For this one night, she would be his again. In the stillness after the last note, the Fox Lord said, "Come." Hitoshi followed Hanoi down the hall. A sliding door scraped open. As he entered the new room, he caught another wisp of the kitsune's scent. He wanted to bury himself in that smell, which had clung to her hair and neck and in the hidden creases of her body. They'd met last year in early spring. He'd wandered off into the woods and encountered a woman in richly layered kimonos, long black hair trailing like an ink spill. Her eyebrows had shot up, and she'd brought up her fan to hide her face, but not before he glimpsed her petal-like lips. "Are you lost?" she'd asked. It was lust that first drew him, but as summer ripened, it was her erudite wit that brought him back. Her poems were a marvel of exquisitely composed nuance layered on nuance. She was like no other woman, one who could understand a man like him, who had chosen a life as a nomadic musician when he didn't belong anywhere. When one night the round yellow moon revealed her true self in her shadow, with its pointed ears and 7 tails, he should have fled and saved himself, but she was his kitsune, and he'd only loved her more. Then one evening he'd arrived unannounced, only to find her entertaining others. She even had the gall to invite him to join. He never saw her again. Tonight he'd make her regret what she'd lost when she'd betrayed him. The screen door whispered shut as he sat down. A moth trapped in a lantern fluttered its wings against the paper shade. Then Hitoshi heard the soft crinkle of incense coming alight. Here was the test. If his song had succeeded, she'd do what he wanted. "Put it out." "As you wish." Did he hear a smile to her words? "I want to smell you." Again a rustle of cloth as the Fox Lord came before him. The sleeve rested against his face. Hitoshi grabbed Honoe's hand. He pressed his thumbnail into the creases of the palm and brought the wrist to his nostrils. The scent raced through him, made his nipples into hard, raw points that yearned to be sucked. He pushed back the sleeve and nipped the forearm. Honoe shivered. "Will you tease me?" He let go. "Strip." "Very well." Again, that subtle curve in the voice. Hitoshi stilled his hands on his thighs as Honoe dropped layers of silk to the floor. Foolish, eager Hitoshi, he scolded himself. In this twilight space of enchantment, they had an eternity. He could take his time. He slid his hands along the sharp-angled calves and up the thick thighs to caress the tight buttocks. He buried his face in the silky hair of the man's crotch, pressing his nose against the balls to scent himself with that vulpine musk. Honoe's cock stirred against his cheek. His heart quickened. A strange echo sounded, almost as if there were 2 hearts within him, or perhaps it was Honoe's heart he heard, beating in time to his. He swiped his tongue along the hardening shaft of Honoe's cock and flicked off the salty dew of arousal on its tip. Honoe's abdomen hitched in. Hitoshi smiled. "You like that, do you?" "I want more." As he took Honoe's swollen cock in his mouth, he felt a ghost of a touch on his own body. He pulled back, thinking Honoe had reached for him, but no, Honoe's hands rested on his neck. Honoe dropped to his knees. "Kiss me." Hitoshi brought the man's face to his. Honoe's tongue pried at the seam of his lips as if pleading, "Won't you open for me?" Instead, Hitoshi cupped the lord's balls and rubbed the tender, wrinkled skin. The kitsune liked this, too. Hitoshi drew out the moment. "Beg for it," he said. "Please." Honoe strained toward him. At last Hitoshi opened his mouth to him. Trembling, Honoe plunged his tongue in. So many times he'd felt this kiss in his dreams, the way she tunneled in to wrap her tongue around his and suck it, how she both took what she wanted and yielded to him. Fingernails dug into his cock. He wanted that, too. He wanted all of this, Fox Lord. He rolled onto his back. Honoe curled Hitoshi's legs to his chest and licked him in one slow stroke, from the ass over his balls and along the curved shaft of his erect cock. The musky scent of their arousal mingled together, filled his nose. The salt of sweat spread across Hitoshi's tongue. Then the room shifted and rearranged itself, and suddenly he was the one pushing the Lord's legs up and burying his face between Honoe's ass cheeks. His tongue sought to open that tight pucker of muscle, even as Honoe probed his own. He was both himself and the kitsune at once. Dizziness overcame him. He was back on his back. Honoe had not changed positions. The pounding of 2 hearts sounded in his ears. He clawed the floor. He needed to make sense of what was happening. His song should have overcome her magic. Instead, he was losing himself to her. He tried to breathe, but his breath was not his own. Honoe's chest rose and fell to the same rhythm. "I want you inside," Honoe whispered. The words wrenched from his own lips. "Beg for it." I'll do anything you want." He no longer knew who was speaking. He didn't care. He knew only that he wanted that cock to stretch him open, to feel its heaviness inside, to be bathed in her enchantment. His body was slick with saliva, and the bulb of Hanaway's penis eased in. He gasped. The cock felt impossibly big, but he wanted to take it all in. Hanaway drew himself in and out to the timing of their breath. Their heartbeats came together into one loud throb. In the depths of pleasure, he felt a tight ring resist his own cock's head, felt the aching need to have his entire shaft inside. He and Hanaway were as one again, both the penetrated and the penetrator, and he only wanted more. Then Hanaway shoved in hard and pinned him in place. "You're not really blind, are you?" "No." Hitoshi could barely answer. Hanaway ripped off the blindfold with his teeth. Hitoshi blinked, and in the lantern light he saw his own face, his own body, hard and strong, shining with sweat, in a clean, taut arc, like a wasp about to sting. His mind spun. Hanaway twitched a groin muscle. Hitoshi shuddered. "Please, don't stop." He needed to dance to the relentless beat that thrummed through his ass and cock. He shifted his pelvis up. Hanaway moaned. He gripped Hitoshi's hips and began to whisper a poem, each syllable a stroke in, a stroke out. The orgasm began like a single string vibrating. Hitoshi knew the song, knew how the rhythm would quicken and the melody grow louder. He closed his eyes. The effect was immediate. He was once again in the two of them at once. He pushed in as far as he could, was penetrated deep, but never deep enough. In his mind's eye, he saw his own face above and below him, but when he reached to grip Hanaway's face, his hands tangled in long, fragrant strands of hair. He clenched as the orgasm intensified in pitch until his entire body vibrated with a chord that would not stop. He let out a cry as it finally came over him, shooting to his cock and down his legs, his muscles convulsing around Hanaway's fat length inside him. But there was no release. Hanaway's orgasm crested next, and with a final thrust, Hanaway's cock pulsed inside him. Hitoshi's own hot cum sprayed his stomach. At last the poem was finished, and it was as if the string snapped. They fell apart. Hitoshi breathed the close aroma of their lovemaking. A narrow tongue lapped the cum off his penis and stomach. He reached down, knowing what he would feel even before he stroked the sleek furred head. "You knew it was me from the start, didn't you?" he said. Warm fur rubbed against his skin. A damp nose dug into his armpit. "Your smell gave you away. How bitterly I wept the night you left." The fox shimmered and became the Hanaway he remembered, the lithe woman with breasts like soft apricots and blossom lips. His body still hummed with her touch, and his heart ached with love. She awoke his passion so easily, so fluidly played the song of his desire. He'd forgotten how much he missed her. He kissed a length of her black hair. "You betrayed me." She propped herself up on an elbow. "You wanted me to be a kept woman, willing to console herself while she waited for you. My love knows no bounds, but you would tie me to you on a leash." It was hopeless. She couldn't even understand that she'd wronged him. Time to send her back through the demon gate. "I'm almost sorry to do this." He reached for his biwa. The instrument was winter cold. He smashed it over his knee, and among the splintered remains he found the rolled-up heart sutra he'd hidden there. Hanaway sat up. He unfurled the scroll and held it before her. "You assume this haunting is of my making," she said, "but it's yours." "Silence, evil one!" He began to recite the sutra. She rubbed her long white throat. "Your actions command the truth. Very well. Here it is." Lies. A demon's mumbling. He tried to shut her out, but the room began to shift and coalesce around a new vision. Golden lantern light filled the room. He lay on silk pillows. Someone was pushing into him from behind. A wet friction between his legs shot heat up his torso. A man worked his tongue against him. But Hitoshi had no penis, rather, a woman's soft opening. He was Hanaway, playing out the events of that fateful summer evening. Wild pleasure spilled out of her. Wild pleasure spilled out of her, but he also felt the urgency of the man thrusting behind her, the eagerness of the other to feel Hanaue come against his mouth, and Hanaue binding them all together. The door rattled open. Startled, he witnessed himself standing in the door. Knowing what was to come, he wanted to turn away, but the vision sharpened in focus, and he became himself in that moment. Fury shook him. He spotted the katana on the floor, drew it, slashed one man across the stomach, grabbed the other's hair and lopped off his head. The faces that leered at him in death were the warlords. The vision vanished. He jammed his wrist to his mouth to quell the rising bile. In the moment he'd been her, he'd seen into her heart. She hadn't intended to trick or humiliate him, nor did she simply use others to gratify herself. Rather, she played her lovers like treasured instruments, coaxing the purest, richest tone out of each, to make each body sing with a melody all its own. The music she made was born of that ephemeral moment of joy and union, of vulnerability and surrender. "You don't remember this," she began, "but year after year you return here to recreate this moment, when vengeance became your life's purpose. This curse of jealous rage is more powerful than my magic and yours." She took his hand. "Each year, the events play out a little differently. This year, you are close to ending it. I can feel it. Let go of your jealousy. Free yourself. Be my lover again." A new vision came to mind. He could be Hanaue's lover among many. Men, women, fox spirits, each free to love as they would, drawn together by their admiration for her. No, he could never share her. Such a love was impossible. What she'd shown him were lies, just another trick of hers. He slapped the sutra against her chest. "Be gone, demon!" She fell back, her hair flying up in a halo. Blood welled from a seam in the floorboards and dried into 2 rusty pools. On the borders of the stain, decay spread. The floorboards blackened and rotted away. Black mold spread on the paper of the screen door. A ceiling beam crashed down and punched a hole in the floor. "You won't end the curse this way!" Hanaue shimmered. Lies! The sutra would strip away all the enchantment and leave the place derelict. He had to find the women and escape. He lunged for the corridor. His foot sank into a rotten spot. He fell to his knees and twisted around to pull his foot out. Something caught it. He grabbed his leg and yanked. His foot came free, but something black wrapped around his ankle. Hair. His hand scrabbled to rip free, but more and more unreeled from the hole in the floor. Strands bound his wrists and slithered up his limbs. "Be gone!" He tore free and struggled to his feet. Then the smell hit him. Decaying flesh and stagnant water, rotten wood and corrupted filth. The sliding door fell apart as he opened it. He lurched into the corridor. Shadows turned to black hair that reached for him. A lock wrapped his toe. He jerked away and stumbled down the hall. The 2 women lay in one of the east rooms, embraced by skeletons hanging with decaying flesh. "Get up!" he cried. One woman opened her eyes. Then she saw the decrepit arm across her stomach. She screamed and shoved the corpse away. Its head rolled into the corner. He helped her up. The other woman was already on her feet. The other ghost sat up, hands clutching the fetid guts that spilled from the shreds of muscle that remained of its belly. "This way," Hitoshi said. The severed head grinned. "See you next year." They fled into the silent courtyard, the icy gravel biting their feet. The old stones of the garden with their caps of white snow watched as they ran along the frost-slick bridge. At last they staggered against the crumbling exterior wall. "It's all right," Hitoshi said. "We're safe now." His coat was right where he'd left it. He draped it over the women, who clutched each other. Then he stepped away. He wouldn't last long naked in the frigid air, but he had to look. Snow fell on the broken beams and shattered tiles of the once grand mansion, and disappeared into the blackness of a jagged hole in the roof. Nothing pursued him. Hanaue had lied. He'd vanquished them all. He trembled. As he turned to go, something tickled his hand. A long black hair twined around his fingers. He shook his hand, but it clung to him, trailing back to the ruins. And that's our story. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this podcast, head to patreon.com/Nobilis. As a supporter, you will have access to a personal RSS feed that you can drop into your podcatcher. And if you want monthly bonus content, bump up your support to $3 a month. And finally, remember to pick up Monster Whisperer Second Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website. There's also an audiobook available on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.